Millionaire disguises himself as a construction worker and enters his own company. He is horrified by what he discovers. The day dawned cloudy in Los Angeles. Samuel Green, a man accustomed to luxury and power, stood in front of a mirror, adjusting the fake beard that completed his disguise. The reflection staring back at him was almost unrecognizable: disheveled hair, a faded shirt, and a worn cap that concealed much of his identity. Gone was the CEO of one of the country's largest construction companies. Now he was Jason Smith, an ordinary worker, ready to uncover what was wrong with the company's most ambitious project, the luxury condominium Aurora. On the way to the construction site, Samuel felt a mix of nerves and determination. For weeks he'd been hearing rumors about materials mysteriously disappearing and a toxic environment for workers. No formal complaints had reached the main office, but something didn't sit right with him. The company was his father Charles Green's legacy, and any blemish on its reputation was unacceptable. When he arrived at the site, Samuel was greeted by a scene that sharply contrasted with the pristine lobbies of his corporate headquarters. Rusty machinery, exhausted workers, and supervisors shouting orders at full volume painted a chaotic picture. He immediately noticed the lack of safety. Workers handled heavy materials without proper equipment, and the sound of misaligned machinery echoed across the site. At the gate, he was met by Stephen, the site manager, a burly man with a hoarse voice and a wary look. "New guy, huh?" Stephen muttered, not even offering a handshake. "That's right. Name's Jason," Samuel replied, keeping his tone firm but simple. "I'm here to do my job and help where I can." "That's what I like to hear. No trouble, okay? I'm the one in charge here." Stephen spat on the ground and pointed toward a pile of bricks. "Start by unloading that." Samuel grabbed a pair of torn gloves and headed to the pile. Each brick felt heavier than he remembered from his rare visits to construction sites. As he worked, he noticed curious glances from the other workers. Some whispered among themselves, likely trying to figure out who the new guy was. During the lunch break, Samuel sat with a group of workers and tried to strike up a conversation. He learned that many were dissatisfied, complaining about delayed wages and terrible working conditions. One of them, an older man named David, shared stories of accidents that were constantly covered up to avoid inspections. "This place is rotten to the core," David said, nervously glancing around. "I'd say more, but I know no one would listen. And if they did, they'd probably make me disappear." Samuel listened carefully, absorbing every detail. He knew he'd need concrete evidence, but what David had said was enough to confirm that something was wrong. In the middle of the afternoon, while carrying bags of cement, Samuel met Abigail. She was walking around the site with a clipboard, inspecting a steel structure. Her eyes were sharp, and her expression showed both intelligence and weariness. She approached when she noticed Samuel looking lost amid Stephen's confusing orders. "You're new here, right?" she asked with a friendly smile. "Yes, I started today. I'm Jason." Samuel extended his hand, which Abigail briefly shook. "I'm Abigail, the engineer responsible for this mess." She laughed, but quickly grew serious. "If you need anything, let me know. And please be careful. These structures aren't exactly safe." Samuel noticed the frustration in her voice. Abigail was clearly committed to her work, but seemed to be fighting a lonely battle to keep the project up to standard. That brief interaction made him realize she could be a valuable ally. At the end of the day, as the sky darkened, a shout echoed across the construction site. Samuel dropped what he was doing and ran toward the noise, finding a small group of panicked workers. One of them was on the ground, blood dripping from his forehead. A steel beam had come loose and fallen from a significant height. "Call an ambulance!" Abigail shouted, kneeling beside the injured man. Stephen arrived moments later, but instead of showing concern, he started yelling at the workers. "Which idiot left this like that? This is carelessness. Now get back to work." he barked, ignoring the injured man's condition. Abigail stood up, furious. "Stephen, this is negligence. That beam wasn't properly secured. You knew this was a risk." "Don't lecture me, Missy. If you want it fixed, go secure it yourself," Stephen snapped, turning his back and walking away. Samuel watched silently, anger growing inside him. He helped carry the injured worker to the gate, where an ambulance was waiting. On the way, Abigail turned to Samuel and said, "This happens more often than it should. If I could, I'd report it all. But they don't care." Her eyes were filled with frustration and perhaps a suppressed desire for change. That night, Samuel returned home exhausted and deep in thought. His disguise was working, but he knew he was only scratching the surface of something much bigger. David's words and Stephen's attitude echoed in his mind. Moreover, he couldn't ignore Abigail's strength and determination. It was clear he would need her to dig deeper into his investigation. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. Tomorrow was a new day, and he was more determined than ever to uncover the truth. The dawn at the Aurora project construction site brought a fresh wave of tension. Samuel, still in his role as Jason Smith, woke up early, determined to delve deeper into the irregularities that were beginning to surface, like cracks in an apparently solid structure. Early in the morning, while unloading a truck of materials, he noticed something odd. Part of the shipment recorded in the inventory simply wasn't there. Samuel observed the foreman jotting down numbers that didn't match the amount being unloaded. The discrepancy seemed small, but it was enough to raise suspicions. He made a mental note of the incident, planning to investigate further. During the lunch break, Samuel found Abigail studying the blueprint of a recently constructed structure. He approached her, feigning casual interest. "These blueprints look complicated, huh?" he said, pointing at the drawings. Abigail laughed. "For someone not used to them, they might. But the problem isn't the design, it's how it's being executed." She sighed and pointed at a column on the site. "See that over there? It's misaligned. That shouldn't happen, but it does when they use low-quality materials or cut corners during construction." Samuel could see that Abigail was frustrated but also determined. He decided it was time to partially involve her in his investigation. "Abigail, can I ask you something?" He hesitated for a moment. "Have you noticed anything strange here? I mean, like materials disappearing or things like that?" She looked up, surprised by the direct question. "All the time. Ever since I started here, I've been trying to figure out what's going on. There are invoices that don't add up, materials that arrive and vanish, and budgets that make no sense. I've tried bringing it up with my superiors, but they just ignored me. I think they prefer not to know." Her honesty strengthened Samuel's trust in her. He knew he needed someone like Abigail to unravel the web of corruption that was starting to come to light. Later that day, Samuel got the chance to enter the small administrative office on the site. He knew he was taking a huge risk, but couldn't pass up the opportunity. While organizing some boxes of files, he found a stack of invoices. At first glance, they seemed like ordinary documents, but upon closer inspection, he noticed something suspicious. The prices were inflated. A shipment of cement, which should have cost a fraction of the listed amount, was recorded with an exorbitant price. He quickly took photos of the documents with his phone before putting them back. The following day, an unexpected event reinforced his suspicions. While working near the storage area, Samuel saw Stephen, the foreman, talking to a well-dressed man who looked out of place in the gritty construction environment. The man carried a black briefcase and spoke in hushed tones, but Samuel managed to catch part of their conversation. "The trucks will arrive at night. I've got everything ready," Stephen said in a conspiratorial tone. "Good. I'll take care of the rest," the man replied before shaking Stephen's hand and walking away quickly. Samuel couldn't hear anything more, but the interaction made it clear that something much larger was going on. Stephen wasn't just an authoritarian supervisor, he seemed to be at the center of a scheme to divert materials. That night, While the workers rested, Samuel took the opportunity to talk to Mr. David. The older worker, who had previously mentioned problems on the site, seemed hesitant to say more. "Look, Jason, I know you're new here and seem like a good guy, but let me give you some advice. Watch yourself. Around here, speaking up can get you into trouble. There are powerful people involved in all this." David's words were a warning. Samuel already knew he was dealing with something serious, but now he understood the consequences could be dangerous. Even so, he couldn't back down. He had to keep going, no matter the risk. The next day, Samuel approached Abigail again, determined to share part of the information he had gathered. They met in a secluded corner of the site, where they could talk without being overheard. "Abigail, do you trust me?" Samuel asked, looking her in the eyes. She hesitated but nodded. "I think so." "Why?" "Because I need your help to figure out what's going on here. I found some invoices that don't make sense and saw Stephen in a suspicious meeting. I think he's involved in something big." Abigail thought for a moment before responding. "I knew something was wrong. I can't believe it's just him. There must be more people involved, probably higher up." Their conversation was interrupted by Stephen's shout, calling them back to work. But the brief exchange was enough to solidify their partnership. Abigail seemed ready to help, even though she didn't know who Samuel really was. In the weeks that followed, Samuel and Abigail began gathering more evidence. He took advantage of moments when Stephen wasn't around to photograph documents and eavesdrop on suspicious conversations, while Abigail used her access as an engineer to scrutinize contracts and invoices. Gradually, they started piecing together a puzzle that revealed the extent of the corruption. Samuel knew he was still far from understanding the full scope of the problem, but the pieces were beginning to fit. Each day at the construction site brought new challenges and dangers, but he was determined to keep going. Even though he didn't know who he could trust, he felt Abigail was a true ally, and together they could face anything. Still, Mr. David's words echoed in his mind. "Be careful who you trust." Days at the construction site were tenser than ever. Samuel, still playing the role of Jason Smith, felt the walls closing in. He and Abigail had already gathered enough evidence to expose the irregularities, but they knew they were dealing with dangerous people. With every step forward, the risk of being discovered grew. That morning, while carrying beams for the construction of a new floor, Samuel noticed Stephen watching him from a distance. The foreman's gaze was sharper than usual. Samuel pretended not to notice but knew something had changed. Later, while resting in the makeshift cafeteria, one of the workers approached and whispered, "Stephen's got his eye on you, man. He thinks you're not who you say you are. Better watch yourself." Samuel nodded, discreetly thanking him for the warning. He knew he'd need to be even more cautious. That night, Samuel and Abigail met in the project room, a space rarely used at that hour. She had brought new documents she had accessed after insisting on additional permissions within the construction site's system. Among the papers were supply contracts with outrageous clauses, clearly indicating blatant overpricing. "Look at this," Abigail said, pointing to a spreadsheet. "These suppliers are being paid 3 times the normal market rate. It doesn't make any sense." Samuel examined the papers and felt a tightening in his chest. Among the signatures on the contracts was the name Vincent, the company's vice president. "Vincent?" Samuel murmured, almost in disbelief. "You know him?" Abigail asked, intrigued. "He's the company's vice president. He's always been close to my—" He stopped, realizing he'd said too much. "The owner." Abigail gave him a suspicious look, but chose not to press the matter at that moment. "If he's involved, this goes way beyond what we imagined. We need more proof." In the following days, Stephen began acting more directly. He assigned one of the supervisors, a man named +++++, to keep a close watch on Samuel. Samuel noticed he was being followed during breaks and that Tyler always seemed to appear wherever he went. Despite this, Samuel continued his investigation. One night, he decided to infiltrate the small administrative office again. He needed to confirm that Vincent was indeed behind the scheme. Samuel's heart pounded as he rifled through the files. Finally, he found a dossier that directly implicated Vincent in suspicious transactions. He quickly took photos, but as he finished, he heard footsteps in the hallway. Samuel froze. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he turned off the light and hid behind a shelf. The door opened and Stephen entered, lighting the room with his phone's flashlight. "I know someone's here," he said firmly. Samuel barely breathed. Stephen slowly walked through the room, sweeping the flashlight in all directions. As he approached the shelf where Samuel was hiding, a noise in the hallway drew his attention. "Who's there?" Stephen shouted, rushing out to investigate. Samuel seized the distraction and slipped out through the back door, barely believing he had escaped. The next morning, Abigail was summoned to Stephen's office. He accused her of sticking her nose where it doesn't belong and hinted that her constant complaints about the site's management were being frowned upon by upper management. But instead of backing down, Abigail confronted Stephen. "If you think you can intimidate me, you're sorely mistaken. I know you're involved in something shady, and if you keep threatening me, I'll make sure to prove it," she said firmly. Abigail's courage impressed Samuel, who heard about the confrontation later. He knew she was taking a big risk, but her commitment inspired him. They had to keep going. As Samuel reviewed the evidence they had collected, he began reflecting on the impact this would have on the company. Green Constructions was more than a business. It was his father's legacy. His father had always taken pride in maintaining an impeccable reputation, but now Samuel wondered if that reputation had been real. If Vincent was involved, who else might be? How far had the corruption spread? These doubts gnawed at Samuel, but also strengthened his resolve. He knew he had to clean up the company, no matter the cost. One night, as they organized the documents in the small storage room where they met in secret, Abigail noticed the weight on Samuel's shoulders. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world," she said with a light smile. Samuel sighed. "Maybe I am. I just want this to be over, but I feel like we're fighting something much bigger than the two of us." Abigail placed a hand on his shoulder. "We're not alone. The workers are counting on us, even if they don't know it, and if we keep pushing, we can make a difference." Her words brought a moment of relief, but Samuel knew the road ahead would be even more difficult. The next day, Stephen called a meeting with the supervisors. Listening from a distance, Samuel realized he was being mentioned. "That Jason guy is way too curious for my liking. I want to know everything he does. Nothing strange can slip by." Samuel knew the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. He and Abigail needed to act quickly before they were discovered. Meanwhile, Vincent's shadow loomed over everything like a threatening presence. With every new discovery, it became clearer that the corruption within the company wasn't just a deviation. It was a carefully planned network that reached the highest levels. Samuel felt he was on the verge of uncovering something big, but he also knew that the price of reaching the truth could be steep. The silence in the site office was almost palpable. Samuel was reviewing the latest documents he and Abigail had gathered when his phone rang. Not the one belonging to Jason Smith, the worker, but his personal phone, used only for emergencies. Answering it, Vincent's voice hit him like a blow. "Samuel, we need to talk. Now." The vice president's tone was serious, almost threatening. Samuel had no choice but to agree. He left the construction site in a hurry, still dressed in his disguise, and drove to a secluded cafe where Vincent had arranged to meet. Upon arrival, he found the man sitting at a table in the back, his expression oscillating between disdain and confidence. "So it's true. Our dear CEO undercover as a worker. What a curious scene," Vincent said with a cynical smile. Samuel remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I know what you're doing," But before you point fingers, perhaps you should understand the complexity of it all. Vincent leaned forward. The problem here isn't me, Samuel. It's the other board members. They've been taking advantage of your absence to profit at your expense. I, on the other hand, am trying to contain the damage. Containing the damage? Samuel finally replied, his voice laced with irony. You call inflating contracts and diverting materials damage control? Vincent chuckled softly, shaking his head. Naive as always. This is more than just a company, Samuel. It's a power game, and you're playing for the wrong side. After the meeting, Samuel returned to the site with a lingering sense of discomfort. Vincent hadn't just confirmed his suspicions, but had also planted a seed of doubt. Were other board members truly involved? And if so, how deep did the scheme go? When Samuel told Abigail about the meeting, she was alarmed. He knows you're investigating. This is dangerous, Samuel. They won't hesitate to protect themselves no matter the cost. Samuel knew she was right, but he was determined to press on. With Abigail's support, he deepened his investigation. He discovered that the financial diversions were far greater than he had imagined, involving fake contracts, duplicate invoices, and even offshore accounts. The scheme wasn't just siphoning millions from the company, it was also compromising the safety of its projects. Days later, the inevitable happened. One morning, which began like any other, Samuel was summoned to an urgent meeting at Green Construction's headquarters. Entering the conference room, he was met with cold, tense stares. Vincent was there, along with other board members. Samuel, we have something serious to discuss, Vincent began, his tone calculated. We've received allegations of financial irregularities involving you. Samuel stood still, trying to process what he had just heard. That's ridiculous. I would never. He started to protest, but a director interrupted, placing a stack of documents on the table. These reports show suspicious financial activity in your name. Large transfers to foreign accounts, contracts approved directly by you without board oversight. Samuel skimmed through the documents. They were forged, but so meticulously crafted that they could convince anyone who didn't know the truth. This is a setup, he said, trying to stay calm. You know that. Vincent stood, feigning concern. Samuel, everyone here respects the work you've done for the company, but this evidence is too serious to ignore. We'll have to open a formal investigation. The scandal spread quickly. Within hours, the news was in every paper and on every website. Green Construction's CEO accused of embezzling millions. The media wasted no time portraying Samuel as the villain in a story he had tried to fight. Devastated, Samuel took refuge at home, avoiding contact with everyone except Abigail. When she arrived, she found him sitting in his living room, staring at a pile of documents. They've won, Abigail, he said, his voice heavy. I tried to protect my father's legacy, and now I'm being accused of destroying it. Abigail approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. They only win if you give up. You knew this could happen. They're trying to destroy you because they're afraid of what you can expose. Her words reignited something in Samuel. She was right. Despite everything, they still had the evidence they had collected. There was still a chance to turn the tide. But how? He asked, looking at her. The media, the board, everyone's against me. Then we start again, outside the spotlight. If we can't rely on them, we take this directly to the public. We've gathered plenty of evidence, Samuel. Now we need a plan. In the days that followed, Samuel and Abigail worked tirelessly. They reviewed all the evidence, assembling a detailed dossier that exposed the corruption and the true culprits. Meanwhile, Abigail used her network of contacts to find allies willing to help bring the truth to light. Samuel knew he was risking everything, but it was his only chance to save the company and his name. Each day was a race against time as the conspirators continued to manipulate the public narrative. By the end of that week, Samuel felt more determined than ever. He didn't know what the future held, but he had one thing the conspirators could never destroy: the truth. The days following the scandal were marked by escalating tension. Samuel found himself in the eye of a storm, threatening to destroy not only his reputation, but also his family's legacy. The company his father, Charles Green, had built seemed to be crumbling under accusations of corruption, financial scandals, and now an imminent threat. A hostile takeover led by Joseph Green, Charles's younger brother and Samuel's uncle. Samuel learned of Joseph's move during an emergency meeting called by the board. Seated around the large polished wooden table, he listened as Joseph, his voice dripping with feigned concern, presented his proposal. "With all due respect, Samuel, it's evident that you've lost control of the company. The press is tearing Green Constructions apart. Our shareholders are uneasy, and frankly, we need leadership that inspires confidence." He paused, glancing around at the others. "That's why I propose taking over as interim CEO until this crisis is resolved." Samuel felt his blood boil, but he restrained himself. He knew Joseph wasn't interested in saving the company. He was exploiting the situation to fulfill a long-held desire to take control of Green Constructions. "This isn't an offer. It's a blatant attempt to take what isn't yours, Uncle," Samuel responded firmly. "And as long as I have strength, I'll fight to protect my family's legacy." Joseph smiled, a cold and calculated expression. "Legacy?" he asked, leaning forward. "Do you really know what you're protecting, Samuel? Or would you rather keep living in the illusion that your father was untouchable?" The insinuation hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Samuel didn't reply, but those words planted a seed of doubt he couldn't shake. Back at the makeshift office in his home, Samuel and Abigail pored over the documents they had collected. Among contracts and invoices, they found a set of older files, apparently overlooked by the conspirators. "Look at this," Abigail said, pointing to a spreadsheet dated 20 years earlier. "These records don't add up. Contracts signed by your father with companies that no longer exist, and absurd transfers to untraceable accounts." Samuel examined the papers, feeling the weight of the revelation. The numbers didn't lie. Charles Green, the man he had always admired, had engaged in unethical practices to ensure the company's growth. "This can't be true," Samuel murmured, shaking his head. "He always talked about ethics, about building something bigger than ourselves." Abigail placed a hand on his shoulder. "Samuel, everyone makes mistakes, even the people we admire. But that doesn't change the fact that you have the chance to do things differently." Her words struck a chord. Samuel knew she was right, but it didn't lessen the impact of the discovery. He realized he wasn't just fighting external conspirators, but also the shadows of his family's past. Meanwhile, Joseph intensified his efforts to take over the company. Using the scandals and public mistrust as leverage, he began meeting with shareholders, promising stability and growth under his leadership. With Vincent and other conspirators backing the takeover, the pressure on Samuel grew, but amidst the chaos, a new hope emerged. During a meticulous review of the records, Abigail found a file that could be the key to exposing Vincent and his allies. It was a ledger detailing specific transactions, linking Vincent to fraudulent accounts and inflated contracts. "This is enough to blow everything wide open," Abigail said, holding the paper like a trophy. "But we need to be careful. If this falls into the wrong hands too soon, we could lose everything." Samuel knew they were dealing with people who would do anything to protect their interests, but he also knew there was no more room for hesitation. They had to act. Samuel called a meeting with a group of strategic shareholders, presenting the evidence he had gathered. He explained the extent of the corruption, detailing how Vincent and other conspirators were sabotaging the company for personal profit. However, The battle was far from over. Joseph used every weapon at his disposal, including the media, to discredit Samuel. The tension reached its peak when Joseph, at a public press event, declared, "It's unfortunate to see the state my family has left this company in, but I'm here to ensure that Green Constructions gets back on track with transparency and responsibility." Samuel watched the speech on television, feeling his anger simmer again, but Abigail, sitting beside him, squeezed his hand. "He's playing with a stacked deck. We'll play ours, but at the right time." In the days that followed, Samuel and Abigail prepared an audacious plan to reveal the truth. At a press conference organized by Samuel, he began by acknowledging his own mistakes and addressing the crisis the company was facing. In recent months, Green Constructions has been under intense scrutiny, and I understand everyone's concerns. Today, I want to show you that we are committed to restoring trust and transparency. He then presented the evidence against Vincent and the other conspirators, detailing the corruption scheme and its impact on the company. The revelation shocked everyone, especially when Samuel included documents indicating his father's past mistakes. I'm not here to hide the errors of the past, but to ensure they are never repeated. The press conference had an immediate impact. Joseph, watching the event from his office, realized his plan had failed. He still had support from some shareholders, but Samuel's compelling argument had shaken his chances. By the end of the day, Samuel and Abigail were exhausted but relieved. The road ahead would still be long, but they had taken a crucial step toward regaining control of the company. As they watched the sunset from the balcony, Samuel looked at Abigail with gratitude. "I don't know how I would have gotten this far without you," she smiled. "You would have found a way, but I'm glad I could help." The battle was far from over, but Samuel knew that together they could face anything. The sun had barely risen when Samuel and Abigail entered Green Constructions headquarters, ready to execute the boldest plan of their lives. The company's corridors, once symbols of power and tradition, now buzzed with uncertainty. Employees whispered, avoiding eye contact, as rumors about the company's future ran rampant. Samuel felt the weight of the moment, but also knew it was his best chance to change everything. In the main auditorium, journalists from across the country eagerly awaited the press conference. Microphones and cameras were positioned, ready to capture every word. The controversy surrounding Green Constructions had dominated the news, and now everyone was expecting answers. Samuel stepped onto the stage with Abigail by his side. He dressed simply, forgoing his usual elegant suit, which made him appear more human and approachable. After a few seconds of silence, he began speaking, his voice firm, yet tinged with emotion. "Today, I am not here as the CEO of Green Constructions. I am here as Samuel Green, someone who failed to protect his family's legacy, but who is determined to rebuild it." The room fell into absolute silence. He took a deep breath and continued. "Over the past months, I've been investigating irregularities that have been corroding our company from within. I've gathered evidence that shows how some of our leaders abused their positions for personal gain, compromising the ethics and safety of our projects." As he spoke, images and documents appeared on a screen detailing fraudulent contracts, misappropriated resources, and illicit transactions. Each piece of evidence struck a blow to the credibility of the guilty parties, whose names were now exposed without hesitation. But Samuel didn't stop there. "I've also discovered that these mistakes didn't start recently. Older documents reveal that my father, Charles Green, made similar errors in the past. He made decisions that helped foster the culture that now threatens to destroy our company. I acknowledge this with pain, but also with the conviction that we must change." The revelation was shocking. It was rare to see a leader expose their family's faults so openly. Samuel knew this could weaken him, but he also knew it was necessary to restore Green Construction's credibility. After a tense moment of silence, Samuel announced his solution. To ensure this never happens again, I'm transferring 51% of Green Construction's shares to a community trust. This trust will be managed by representatives of our workers, the communities benefiting from our projects, and partners committed to transparency. The room erupted into murmurs. It was an unprecedented move. For the first time, the majority control of one of the country's largest construction companies would be handed to a community trust, taking power out of the Green family's hands and returning it to those most affected by its decisions. This isn't just a symbolic gesture, it's a commitment to transparency, ethics, and social impact, Samuel concluded. Joseph Green, watching the press conference from one of his offices, knew at that moment that his plan had failed. The share transfer made his hostile takeover impossible, and the public exposure of the conspirators destroyed any future manipulation. With no alternatives, Joseph retreated, disappearing from the public eye. In the weeks that followed, Samuel and Abigail dedicated themselves to transforming the company. All contracts were digitized and made publicly available, and an ethics council was formed, composed of representatives from the community trust. The transition was challenging, marked by internal resistance and financial hurdles. But gradually, the new governance began yielding results. Projects resumed with greater efficiency, and the company started regaining the trust of investors and clients. During this process, Samuel and Abigail found strength in one another. After so many challenges, their bond grew deeper and stronger. One evening, while walking together through one of the company's first revitalized projects, Samuel stopped and looked at Abigail with a sincere smile. "You know none of this would have been possible without you, right?" She laughed, shaking her head. "This was a team effort, Samuel, and there's still a lot to do. I know, but before that I want to ask you something." He held her hand, hesitating for just a moment before continuing. "Are you with me not just to build a better company, but to build a life together?" Abigail smiled, moved. "Always." Months later, Green Constructions was recognized as an example of ethics and innovation in the industry. The community trust not only managed the company's shares, but also funded social projects such as affordable housing and infrastructure for underserved communities. Samuel and Abigail, now married, led the company with a shared vision. For them, it wasn't just about rebuilding Green Constructions, but about creating a legacy that truly reflected the values that mattered most: honesty, fairness, and a commitment to the greater good. Despite the challenges, they found purpose and love amidst the chaos, ready to build a more just future together. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.